Why the United States and Europe betrayed Ukraine, not because they lacked the words, not because they lacked the warnings. They betrayed Ukraine because, when history demanded sacrifice, too many Western leaders chose caution, delay, domestic comfort, and political theater over victory. For 4 years, the West has wrapped Ukraine in the language of solidarity while repeatedly shrinking from the full consequences of that solidarity. Washington and European capitals declared that Ukraine was fighting for freedom, for sovereignty, for the rules-based order, even for Europe itself. All of that was true. And yet the policy that followed was too often late, hesitant, fragmented, and calibrated not to win the war decisively, but to manage it, contain it, and survive it politically at home. That is why the word betrayal is not excess rhetoric. It is a moral description of a strategic failure. The betrayal did not happen in one dramatic act. It happened in stages. It happened each time Ukraine was promised support for as long as it takes, while the actual delivery of weapons, funding, and political cover was slowed by internal arguments, budget fights, election cycles, coalition fragility, or fears of escalation. It happened each time Western governments spoke as if a Ukrainian defeat would be a civilizational disaster, but then behaved as if preventing discomfort in their own domestic politics mattered more than ensuring a Ukrainian victory. That contradiction has defined the entire Western approach. Look at the present moment. In March 2026, Reuters reported that the Pentagon was considering redirecting military aid originally intended for Ukraine to the Middle East because of pressure on U.S. stockpiles. Among the items reportedly at risk were air defense interceptors, exactly the kind of high-end systems Ukraine depends on to protect cities and infrastructure. That is not a technical budget adjustment. It is the essence of abandonment. Ukraine is told its survival matters until another crisis enters the room. Then it slides down the priority list. At roughly the same time, Reuters also reported that President Volodymyr Zelensky said the United States had linked security guarantees to Ukrainian concessions in Donbass. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas publicly warned against territorial concessions and called such demands part of the Russian playbook. Whether one calls it pressure, coercion, or diplomacy, the underlying message is unmistakable. After years of bloodshed, Ukraine is still being asked to bargain away land under the shadow of invasion, while its supposed allies debate how much justice they can afford. That is what betrayal looks like in modern geopolitics. Not always a formal renunciation. Not always a signed surrender. More often it appears as a slow-motion normalization of the unacceptable. First comes the delay, then the rationing, then the language of realism, then the suggestion that perhaps the victim must compromise, then the subtle reframing of stolen territory as a negotiable problem rather than a crime to be reversed. By the time the betrayal is obvious, it has already been dressed up as prudence. Europe, for its part, deserves neither easy absolution nor lazy dismissal. The European Union has undeniably committed large sums. The European Council stated in March 2026 that, following its December 2025 decision, the EU would provide a €90 billion support loan for 2026 and 2027, with the first disbursement expected by early April. NATO, meanwhile, continues programs for long-term support and innovation cooperation with Ukraine, and Europe now provides a large share of overall assistance. These are not trivial acts. They are significant and real. But Europe's defense cannot rest on accounting alone. Money matters, but so do timing, unity, industrial speed, sanctions discipline, and political courage. Europe has too often acted like a wealthy committee confronted with a civilizational emergency. Heavy on communiques, slow on ammunition, divided on strategy, and still partly trapped in the fantasy that Russian aggression can be contained without a full strategic rupture from the habits that enabled it. When one EU leader warns that Ukraine must not be pressed into land concessions while another member state undermines aid or blocks sanctions, Europe stops looking like a strategic actor and starts looking like a nervous federation of conflicting appetites. Hungary is the ugliest example of that internal sabotage. According to the Associated Press, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán announced that Hungary would cut gas supplies to Ukraine while also blocking major EU assistance and further sanctions. This is not mere dissent inside a pluralistic union. It is obstruction that materially weakens a country under invasion. The larger indictment is not only against Budapest. It is against a Europe that still allows one government, again and again, to hold collective resolve hostage. The United States, however, bears the heaviest responsibility because it remains the indispensable military power in the Western alliance. The hard truth is that Washington has had the means to shape the war more decisively than any other capital and has repeatedly chosen a narrower course. Even when support continued, it was too often structured around scarcity, sequencing, and risk management instead of victory. Ukraine did not need endless moral endorsement. It needed speed, mass, industrial commitment, air defense, and a political doctrine clear enough to tell Moscow that time would not rescue it. Too often Washington sent just enough to prevent collapse, but not enough to end the logic of attrition. That is not strategy worthy of the rhetoric American leaders used. It is strategic half-belief. And half-belief is fatal in war. Western leaders will object that they faced constraints, depleted stockpiles, inflation, elections, alliance management, escalation risks, public fatigue, and competing crises from the Middle East to domestic unrest. Some of that is fair. States do not operate in moral purity. They operate in scarcity. But that defense collapses under its own logic. If Ukraine truly was defending the European security order, then treating its survival as a secondary budget line was not realism. It was self-deception. If leaders believed their own speeches, they should have mobilized industry faster, imposed harder costs on obstruction, and accepted the political burden of sustained support. The fact that they did not means either they misjudged the stakes or lacked the courage to act on them. This matters beyond Ukraine. The betrayal of Ukraine is also the betrayal of Western credibility itself. What does a security guarantee mean if it erodes under political inconvenience? What does never again mean if territorial conquest is slowly converted into a bargaining position? What does the rules-based international order mean if rules are defended passionately in speeches and selectively in practice? Every autocrat in the world studies not only what the West says, but what it endures, delays, or quietly accepts. Ukraine is the test case they are all reading. There is another cruelty in this betrayal. Ukraine was not asking the West to die for it. It was asking the West to stop behaving as if history could be outsourced. Ukrainians have done the dying themselves. They have fought, bled, buried, adapted, endured blackouts, missile strikes, occupation, deportation, and destruction. The least the democratic world owed them was clarity of purpose. Instead, too often they got conditionality, messaging discipline, and calendars. They got summit language when they needed strategic certainty. They got applause when they needed decisive capacity. They got promises stretched across months while Russian force was measured in immediate violence. And still, it must be said plainly, the betrayal is not complete because it is not irreversible. Europe can still prove that its vast declarations mean something. The United States can still decide that a world in which aggression wins by exhaustion is more dangerous than the short-term costs of preventing it. The aid can be accelerated. The industrial base can be expanded. Obstruction inside the alliance can be isolated rather than accommodated. The rhetoric can finally be matched by the scale and urgency of action. Ukraine can still be treated not as a tragic burden to be managed, but as the frontline state whose survival is bound up with the future of European security itself. But if that does not happen, then history's verdict will be unforgiving. It will say that the United States and Europe were warned early, spoke nobly, spent partially, hesitated repeatedly, and in the end allowed the defense of a sovereign democracy to become hostage to electoral fear, bureaucratic delay, and strategic timidity. It will say they called Ukraine heroic while denying it the full means to prevail. It will say that when the decisive test came, the democratic world did not fully rise to its own ideals. And it will say, with brutal simplicity, that Ukraine was not only invaded by Russia, it was also betrayed by the weakness of its friends.